Tower of London, a medieval fortress of hell established by William the Conqueror in 1078. The Tower of London was not merely a fortress, but also the most terrifying prison in medieval England. Its function as a place of confinement began in the 12th century and continued into the 20th century, but its darkest period occurred during the Tudor and Plantagenet eras. The prison was notorious for its torture chambers, featuring devices like the rack, used to stretch the body, the scavenger's daughter, which compressed the body, causing organ damage, and the manacles, used to hang a person by their wrists. This prison made no distinction between commoners and nobility. Anyone could become a victim. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, was beheaded here in 1536. Guy Fawkes, the perpetrator of the 1605 gunpowder plot, was also tortured to the brink of death. Conditions were appalling: damp cells, minimal light, and limited food. Prisoners could pay the guards for better treatment, a clear sign of rampant corruption. Over 112 recorded executions were carried out within its walls before 1600. The Tower of London reflects the injustice and cruelty of the feudal penal system, where justice was subject to the power of the king and the church. Today, it stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, ironically serving as a major tourist attraction. Mamortine Prison, Death's Corridor in the heart of the empire. Located beneath the Roman Forum, the Mamortine Prison, known to the Romans as the Tullianum, is one of the oldest prisons in Europe, active since the 7th century BC and remaining in use until the early Middle Ages. During Rome's transition to Christianity around the 4th to 7th centuries AD, this place became a symbol of torture and silent elimination. The prison consisted of 2 subterranean levels. Prisoners were initially held on the upper floor before being thrown down to the lower level, a cramped space with no windows, ventilation, or food, and, at times, partially submerged in foul water. Known as a place without hope, this chamber measured only about 21 by 11 feet with a 10-foot ceiling, yet it held dozens of people simultaneously. The conditions were lethal: utter darkness, a putrid stench, extreme humidity, and no sanitation system. Many prisoners were left to die slowly from starvation or infection. Notable figures believed to have been imprisoned here include St. Peter and St. Paul, which solidified the prison's mystical yet brutal reputation. In the medieval context, the site was repurposed by Christian authorities to detain and execute political enemies or heretics. The Mamortine was not just a prison, it was a symbol of merciless confinement and silent death. Château d'If, the most isolated and cruel island prison. Built in 1524 by King Francois I on a small island in the Mediterranean Sea, the Château d'If was initially a military fortress. However, from the 16th century to the 19th century, it became one of the most horrifying prisons in France, especially during the early modern era and the transition from the Middle Ages. Located 1.5 kilometers off the coast of Marseille, the Château d'If was chosen for its isolated and nearly inescapable location. Political prisoners, particularly the Huguenots, French Protestants, were often sent here without due process. They were tortured, imprisoned for life, and forced to live in abysmal conditions. Poor prisoners were placed in dark, damp, underground dungeons, while wealthy nobles could rent more humane cells, once again demonstrating the practice of class-based detention. The damp sea air, extreme winds, and lack of sanitation made diseases like tuberculosis and scurvy commonplace. Some prisoners were even driven to madness by the total isolation. The Château d'If's fame grew through Alexander Dumas' novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, 1844, though its story is fictional. However, the reality of the Château d'If was far more gruesome, making it a symbol of a prison without justice or hope. Newgate Prison, the emblem of medieval prison depravity. Established around 1188 in London, Newgate Prison was one of the most brutal and notorious prisons in England. Originally part of the city gate, the building was transformed into the main detention center for all types of criminals, from petty thieves to political dissidents. The internal conditions were horrific: cramped, unventilated cells, teeming with lice, rats, and human filth. Without a steady budget from the government, the prison system relied on extortion by its wardens. Prisoners who couldn't pay were forced into spaces known as the common wards, often in total darkness, sleeping on muddy floors. Diseases like typhus and dysentery were rampant. While physical torture was rare at Newgate, the mental torture and systemic inhumanity were far more destructive. Inmates often waited for months or even years before being tried. Many died before ever getting a chance to defend themselves. Public executions were frequently held outside the prison walls, most notably at Tyburn. Prisoners were paraded through the city streets as a public spectacle. Newgate also became a target for reform in the late 18th century, but in the Middle Ages and beyond, it stood as a symbol of legal chaos and corruption. A place where justice delayed was truly justice denied. Castell Santangelo, Sacred Fortress, Earthly Hell. Originally built as a mausoleum for the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, Castell Santangelo was transformed into a military fortress, a papal residence, and, most terrifyingly, a secret prison of the Catholic Church, especially during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Located on the banks of the Tiber River, the structure was used by Vatican authorities and the Inquisition to hold political enemies, religious dissidents, and even nobles who opposed the Church. Detentions were often carried out without a formal trial, through a secretive process with no access to legal counsel. Many prisoners never left alive. Inside the castle were narrow, windowless underground cells filled with bars and chains. Prisoners were often physically tortured to confess to doctrinal or political errors. Torture devices like the rack, the strappado, and heated irons were used in secret interrogation rooms. One of its most famous cases was Giordano Bruno, a philosopher held here before being burned at the stake for his teachings which were deemed heretical. Although he was executed at Campo dei Fiori, the majority of his imprisonment occurred at Castell Santangelo. Ironically, the castle was named Holy Angel, but within its walls it functioned as a spiritual and physical prison, where faith was enforced through fear and violence. The Oubliette, the prison of the truly forgotten. The word oubliette comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, and that was the primary purpose of this type of prison, to completely forget a prisoner's existence. An oubliette was a type of vertical dungeon, typically shaped like a narrow well with no side doors, accessible only from a small opening at the top. They were commonly found beneath medieval castles in France, England, and Germany. The dimensions of an oubliette were incredibly small, sometimes just large enough for one person to stand or sit without being able to move. Prisoners were dropped into this pitch-black space without food, water, or ventilation. There was no place for waste and no natural light. Inmates were literally left to die a slow death, often from starvation, dehydration, or infection. Unlike a regular cell, the oubliette was not designed for temporary confinement, but as a form of passive and hidden execution. Because the chamber was vertical and narrow, escape was virtually impossible. Victims of the oubliette were generally political enemies, spies, or those considered too dangerous to release but too risky to execute publicly. As a symbol of tyrannical power, the oubliette demonstrates how the absence of voice and space could become the deadliest weapon of oppression in the feudal era. The prison of Carcasson Castle, a hell for heretics and Inquisition prisoners. Carcasson Castle, fortified with double walls and high towers in southern France, became a center of military and religious power in the 13th century. After the Languedoc region was seized by France during the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, the castle was transformed into the headquarters of the Catholic Inquisition and a horrifying prison for heretics, especially the Cathars, a Christian sect deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. Prisoners at Carcassonne were often thrown in without a legitimate trial, on vague accusations such as possessing forbidden texts or skipping Mass. Inside the prisons, they faced harsh interrogations and both physical and psychological torture, such as the strappado, being hoisted by a rope and suddenly dropped to dislocate the shoulders, or confinement in dark dungeons without adequate food. Inquisition records document thousands of interrogations and hundreds of executions over several decades. Many prisoners ultimately died in their cramped cells from infection, starvation, or severe trauma. Archaeological reports have revealed cell walls with carved prayers and final pleas, evidence of their suffering. The prison of Carcasson Castle became a symbol of the church-state's cruelty against freedom of thought, where differing beliefs were met with chains, torture, and a silent death behind thick stone walls. The Black Tower of Poznan, a feudal prison of unspoken suffering. The Black Tower, Czarna Wieża, in the city of Poznan, Poland, was built in the late 13th century as part of the city's defense system, but was quickly repurposed into a brutal prison for criminal, political, and even common prisoners who violated feudal laws. The tower reflected the harsh, authoritarian, and abusive justice system of medieval Eastern Europe. The tall, enclosed structure had narrow detention cells in its basement, windowless, unventilated, and perpetually damp due to its proximity to marshy ground. In winter, temperatures dropped drastically, causing many prisoners to die of hypothermia. Some cells were as small as 2 by 2 meters, about 6.5 by 6.5 feet, and held 5 to 6 people. Prisoners were often shackled in chains, and interrogations were conducted with torture devices, typical of Eastern Europe, such as hot iron pincers and barbed whips. A significant number were detained without an official warrant, solely on the order of a local nobleman or bishop. Lacking a transparent judicial system, the Black Tower became a symbol of arbitrary detention, a place where life and death were determined by social status, not truth. This prison was a stark reflection of the darkness of the feudal legal system, where absolute power meant human life was nearly worthless. Piami Prison, Doge's Palace, hell beneath the lead roofs. Located on the top floor of the Doge's Palace, Palazzo Ducale, the Piambi, meaning the leads in Italian, was one of the most famous and torturous prisons in the city of Venice. In use since the 16th century, its system and methods were deeply rooted in late medieval detention practices, featuring exceptionally extreme conditions. Its cells were situated directly under the palace's lead-plated roof, causing the temperature inside to become scorching hot in the summer and bitterly cold in the winter. The lead conducted heat, creating a deadly sauna effect for the prisoners. Poor air circulation, almost no natural light, and high humidity created the perfect environment for skin and lung diseases to thrive. This prison typically held political prisoners, rebels, and dissidents who were often detained without a public trial. They lived in solitude, interrogated by the Doge's officials, and threatened with execution or forced labor. Its most famous prisoner was Giacomo Casanova, who made a legendary escape in 1756, making the Piambi a symbol of both cruelty and human resilience. Despite being at the heart of Venice's aristocratic power, the Piombi was a paradox of architectural beauty and human cruelty, enveloping suffering within magnificent walls and a toxic roof. The Zindon, a pit of no hope. The term Zindan refers to a type of prison widespread across Central Asia, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire, active from the Middle Ages through the 19th century. A Zindan differed from Western prisons in its form. It was a vertical pit in the ground or a narrow subterranean chamber, usually with no brick walls, just damp earth and rough stone. Prisoners were lowered by rope or ladder into a dark, suffocating space, often filled with mud and wastewater. Some zindans were shaped like wells 13 to 20 feet deep, making them nearly impossible to climb out of. There was no sanitation, little food, and almost no human interaction. Prisoners could live alongside rats, lice, and even the unremoved corpses of fellow inmates. Victims of the Zindan included rebels, tax evaders, or political prisoners, many of whom were held for life without a formal trial. Guards could secretly torture or kill prisoners and often demanded bribes from families for something as simple as a piece of stale bread or dirty water. The Zindan reflects the darkest face of the Eastern feudal legal system. Punishment was not for justice, but for silent elimination. It was a form of confinement where human existence was suppressed until it vanished into earth and time.